Good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night to everyone that's on there. So, who have we got today? Karina's on, Jan is on, Jill's on, Trish is on, Simon's on, Alan's on. Alan's still on from Australia. Pretty late there. The opposite to Jerry, who is still in Arizona at stupid o'clock in the morning. But hi, Jerry. Hi, Willem. What else we got? Richard. Adnan, Abu Dhabi. Ooh, loads of people. Rob, Monday greetings and happy August. Yes, it's August, and I have a new haircut, which is really exciting. Mostly because it's just so much cooler. Okay, so welcome to those of you that have been on here for a long time. Following, hopefully, you know all the ground rules, but as it stands right now, we're going to spend the next hour going through some of your pictures in Capture One. They're not necessarily chosen in terms of any particular theme today. I've just gone through and sort of picked a few out that might have some interest in, especially with some of the tools that we're going to use. So before we get started, let's just look at the version that we're using. So the version of Capture One that we're using today is 13.1.1. That screen keeps disappearing every time that I say that for some reason. But that's actually version 20.1.1 in Capture One. So whether you're doing the marketing thing or the software thing, either way, it's the 0.1.1 version 20 or version 13. Those versions are really important because the 0.1.1 addressed a lot of the bugs that were found in 0.1, and 13.1 or 20.1 was the one that introduced a lot of the new tools like before and after, and the new healing brush stuff that we'll use quite a lot today. So everyone that is online, just bear in mind that any comments that you put in, there's about a 15-second-ish delay depending on how Facebook are feeling today and how YouTube are feeling. But that delay means that it takes a little while for your stuff to come up on the screen before I can see it and then before we can have a look at it. However, please send in questions as we're going. And then as long as that stream keeps going, we can if necessary, we'll go back and play with the pictures if it's even if it's 15 seconds later. Okay, so let's get into Capture One. So Capture One, hello, welcome to the normal workspace of Capture One. Most of you know this workspace by now, but for those of you that don't, basically you've got I'm working in the catalog today. You've got two choices. You can work in a session, as it's known, or a catalog. For me, catalogs make more sense for the way that I work, but both are equally fine. So in a catalog, we've got these collections here, and I've got different collections based on the different people's images that we're going to have a look at today. So we'll start with Bjorn's very cool picture of a rainbow. I don't think I've ever actually seen an entire rainbow that actually goes beyond that and into the ground as well. So it's pretty cool. You've actually got a double rainbow up here. We've got another one on the outside. So as far as the picture goes, it's pretty much set as it is. This is a pretty good picture to start with. We might have a little look at some grid stuff and just make sure that everything's quite symmetrical. And a little play with clarity. Clarity works great on rainbows if you don't have a polarizing filter. So for those of you that aren't familiar with polarizing filters cut light. A circular polarizing filter will cut light that's at a different incidence into the camera other than straight on. So they don't work if you're shooting into the sun. They don't work if you're shooting away from the sun in any massive extent. And on an ultra wide lens, you can end up with a weird effect if you use it at the wrong time. But for rainbows, it can have an effect of making the rainbow a little clearer. It just increases the clarity in the rainbow. If you don't have one on the camera at the time, or you're getting that weird effect because you're on a wide lens, then that's what we use clarity for in Capture One anyway. So don't worry about it too much. So let's start with this one. As always, first stop we're always going to make in Capture One is this tab here, the lens profile or the lens correction tab. And on here, it's loaded in the right lens. It's a Fuji 1024 lens. If it hasn't loaded in the right lens, remember you can always rely on the manufacturer profile if that's loaded in. That means that the camera has sent the information about the lens and the camera into the raw file. If that's not available, then go to the generic one. Generic one is just fine, but you might have to do a little bit of things like doing a manual analyze of your chromatic aberration. You might have to do some playing around with distortion and so on specific to your lens because it's not going to have the automatic profile loaded in. So there's our lens correction done. At f8, there's probably not too much diffraction, so I'm not going to turn that tick box on. It looks pretty sharp out at the edge when I had a little look out here. I mean, yes, we're getting a stretch because it's a wide lens, but that stretch isn't actually going to be fixed by anything in here, and we've already got distortion loaded into 100. For those of you that were watching the other day when we did this, remember, and this actually came up on Facebook this morning or today. So someone asked this, why are my images automatically cropped? The reason they're automatically cropped, if you've got a manufacturer or a lens profile that's automatically applying, is if you're using an ultra wide lens, so anything beyond about 20 millimeters, an equivalent of 35 mil, Capture One is going to load on what's called distortion, and it's going to correct for the distortion in the lens. If I put that down to 0, we can see this image now fills up the whole lot, and my crop, there's nothing cropped out. If I put it back up to 100, where it was, you're seeing two things happen on the screen. So one, it's straightening out the image. It's getting rid of the fisheye effect that can happen with some images. But number two, it's actually cropping in from the outside of the image on the bits that Capture One don't believe is actually a very good quality image. So let's have a look out at this side here. So you see out here, basically at the edges of an ultra wide lens, ironically, exactly why you have an ultra wide lens, but the edges tend to be the bit where it goes all soft, it pulls too much and so on. So what Capture One does is, as you dial in the distortion, it stretches the picture across and gets rid of some of that stuff at the edge of the original image, the edge of the actual raw, and it gets rid of some of that stuff that's not quite as sharp. So effectively, as long as you're happy that the bits at the edge of the image aren't perfect, then by all means dial that distortion back down to 0 and you'll get the whole lot back. If you leave it at 100 and I go to my crop tool, you'll see in here we're losing all that data around the outside. Some would argue the data's no good if it's a bit soft, but actually if it's really important, and on this one I think it is, because the focus isn't on those edges anyway, let's pull it back just a bit, just to get some of that width in the side here, and it gives us a bit more of a border around the rainbow. So question from Nelson, under the lens profile, is there a way to set the manufacturer profile as the default lens profile? Not to my knowledge. So basically what Capture One will do, if it finds a manufacturer profile built into the raw file, it will automatically pick that up and apply it. What you'll find is on some images, we'll look at it later actually, but on some images, if there isn't a manufacturer profile loaded in and there isn't a lens profile that Capture One can match, it will load in generic. You won't have the option to choose manufacturer profile if it hasn't been embedded in the raw. So it will apply it if it's embedded. If it hasn't embedded it, then it means it hasn't found a match for the lens, or it hasn't got a manufacturer profile in there in the first place. So you have to either choose the lens or go to generic. Okay, so we've lowered down that distortion correction. That's given us a huge amount more of the picture. We are also, because I know that we've got a bit of an issue with this image at the edges, we're going to dial in a little bit of sharpness correction. So sharpness fall off and sharpness correction doesn't affect the middle of the picture. It's like a reverse vignette, and it affects the outside of the picture where the lens is its softest. So sharpness fall off will help at those edges, especially given that we've pulled them back in out of the distortion field. Light fall off, well, if we had vignetting on the lens, then we could use that to lighten out the edges, but actually it's pretty good, this lens. I mean, I might dial in a little bit of it, but that's about it. I've had a look earlier, there's no purple fringing. There's a risk in this one. If we dial in purple fringing, or the defringing for purple fringing, we might lose some of the purple in the rainbow, so let's not touch that one either. Okay, so again, because we're on a Fuji camera, the curve that comes in, on a normal Capture One import, you've got auto, film extra shadow, film high contrast, film standard, and linear response. Auto's the one that automatically comes in by name, and that's the one that's going to be used most of the time. But if you're using a Fuji camera, the Fujifilm simulations, just like we've got here on the left, will come in. Now remember, if you've dialed in one of these film simulations at the point that you captured, that's what Capture One is going to load in. So don't be surprised if you happen to dial in for some reason a black and white on a rainbow. When you load in the raw, this is the raw and it's black and white. And you're like, oh no, where's my color gone? Well, actually it's just in this curve. So it's dialed in whatever curve you had selected in the camera, that gets set into the raw file. You can always go back to standard ones, you get a linear response, you can choose a different film simulation, or you can go to Capture One's auto. So don't panic if you're on a Fuji camera and it comes in, it looks like you've lost something because it's been fixed in the raw. It hasn't been fixed, it's just been preloaded because that's what you told the camera you wanted to use to capture it. Okay, theory done. Right, let's get into practice. So here's our image. We've got a lovely horizon out here with the rainbow through the middle of it. I'm just going to check that horizon is straight. So we use the straighten tool at the top. That's the circle around the plus sign. And even though these are hills, they might not be completely flat, we know roughly they are. There was like a ½ degree turn on that. It's pretty straight to start with. What I am going to do, however, is load up my grid. Now, the grid by default is 3x3. If I go back onto my lens tool here, I can actually change the grid. So I can change it from rectangular to golden ratio to the magic spiral that no one can pronounce the first word of. But let's stick with a standard rectangular grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial in 5 along the long edge and 5 along the short edge. And what I'm looking for is, can I get this rainbow to be a little more central in the image? And the answer is probably yes. And I can see, actually, let's just dial in, let's go to 10 along there. That's helping me. So I've got one grid point in here where the rainbow starts, and this one's on the inside of that grid point. So use your grid to do this. If you don't have the grid turned on and you go to your crop tool, as you crop, the grid is automatically going to load in. Now my crop at the moment was set to a different aspect ratio. If I hold down the button or the mouse on the crop tool, you'll see the aspect ratio that was loaded in. I'm going to go back to original. So original is the aspect ratio that was loaded in from the camera for this RAW. So in this case it should be, I think, 3x2. Yep, looks it. Okay, so now as I drag my crop in, I can use that grid that I've just lined up to try and get that even from left to right on that rainbow. Now this is a really subtle difference, but it just means now that our picture is balanced. And actually we can also see on this double rainbow up here and up here that we're nice and central. So there's a bit of a debate that was happening last week about the rule of thirds and so on. It sort of carried on after the session. Generally speaking, rules are wonderful, but please break them when it makes sense. So the rule of thirds would say, you should put the subject on the 1/3 line and so on. If something is so iconic or so geometrically correct that it makes sense to put it smack bang in the middle, then put it smack bang in the middle. And the best bit with this one is we've got this cool shadow that looks like a needle that goes all the way up through the middle. So we're back on our exposure tab up here. So that's the one with the histogram on it. The histogram is going to give us a view of whether or not we've got any data that's down in the low end or off into the shadows or off into the highlights. And actually at this point, this is a pretty good histogram. It's exposed really well. Now in my levels, I may be able to tweak that and we'll have a look at that later. But for right now, what I want to do is just make this sky pop without necessarily affecting the foreground down here. I don't want to take any more distraction away from the sky. So if I do anything with the content down here, so all of the trees and everything, we're going to end up in a place where we're starting to distract from the whole point of this scene, which is the rainbow and those clouds. So let's draw a new layer. So you've got a background layer by default in Capture One. Let's create either a new layer, so I can click on the plus sign and I get a new adjustment layer, and I can do whatever I like with that layer. Or if I haven't got an adjustment layer yet, and I want to do a brush mask or a healing mask or a gradient mask, if I choose the tool that I want, which is along here, and these tools are mimicked up here on our top toolbar, so you've got both options to go for. If I don't already have an adjustment layer in the picture, which I don't at the moment, the second I start drawing a mask with my gradient layer, you can see up there on the left, we've now got adjustment layer 1. So I'm going to draw a mask that's actually going to have quite a hard line. Now just one thing as you're drawing a mask, if this starts to happen, you get a little bit out of control on the horizon because it's very, very sensitive. Hold down the shift key on your keyboard and it will snap to 45-degree increments. That should be really handy, especially if you've just straightened the image. So let's make the transition really quite tight. So remember, the transition on a gradient mask, the further away these lines are, the softer the transition, the longer it takes to get from 100% applied, which is the red bit, down to 0% applied, which is the transparent bit, and this being 50%. So if I press the M button, so M for mask, I can turn the mask off, or turn it on again. And now with that set, I'm actually going to move it down to my horizon to about there. That looks pretty good. Okay, that mask now applies to everything up here and then slowly fades off to no applying down here. Let's just move it down a little bit more. Okay. There's people that I know online. Hi, Jonathan. Jonathan's online from California. And cool. Hi everyone. And Ralph's online as well. Ralph made it. Yay. Okay, so let's now look at what we're going to do with that layer. With this, I'm going to turn the mask off because it can be really difficult to see what's happening behind the layer when the mask is on. So let's just turn that there, press M, or if you wanted to turn it off manually, you could always hold down or click on this button here and choose either to display the mask, only display it when you're drawing, or display the grayscale mask, or never, which is so M is going from never to always display, your choice. So with that set, obviously I could pull down exposure if I want to, but that doesn't make sense. It was obviously bright in the sky. What I do want to do is pull up clarity. So if we, and actually with the sky, because we're not actually too worried about things like halos and everything, I mean, a rainbow is one big halo, so I'm not so worried as I would be normally about like a sunset or a cityscape or something like that, of introducing halos around the areas and the edges with clarity, which I normally would be. So let's put that up quite a reasonable amount. Now we always normally use natural. Natural is the best combination of a lot of the older clarity styles, but let's just have a look at what happens if I move to punch. So with punch, we get quite a strong rainbow effect. Now, the reason is that the clarity that's set to natural is exactly that. It's designed to enhance the contrast, especially around the mid-tones, so where we're losing a lot of detail in contrast, to enhance it, but without creating an unnatural look. Perfect for most situations. Neutral and punch are a little bit more extravagant, let's call it that, in terms of their contrast. So it pushes the contrast a little bit more. And the difference between neutral and punch is that punch also boosts saturation. So if I leave this on punch here, I'm not going to have it dialed up quite so much as I would do on natural. We're going to reduce that down. But let's just have a look at before and after. So I can click on here up on the before tool, or I can press Y on the keyboard and I get before and after. And if we look at that rainbow, effectively, we've just polarized it. We've made it glow. We've made it look like you've actually, this is the same effect that I'd see if I had a polarizing filter on the camera. So normally we would stay way, way away from punch. Punch is great for enhancing saturation at the same time as contrast. So where it can do wonders. Fireworks, we'll talk about that a bit later. Rainbows, and certain cityscapes where the buildings are illuminated with a color show or something like, a light show or something like that at night, then punch clarity can really help, but just be really careful with how much you use it. Don't overdo it. So that's our clarity set. Now going back to the whole image in general, what I'm going to do is go back to my background layer and just cool down our white balance just a touch. Not a huge amount, but I want that sky to feel blue. I'm going to counter some of that because I don't want it to turn a bit green. So tint goes from green to magenta. Kelvin, so white balance temperature, goes from effectively blue up to nice and warm, nice and orange and yellow. So all I'm doing is I'm pushing the image to be a little bit cooler, but also a little bit more pink and away from the green that can happen if you introduce too much coolness into the image. So with those two done, we then end up with this really, really clear view over this rainbow. And the city started to get a little bit clearer out there as well, because even though the mask falls off here, this is still 50% applied at this point here on this line. This is 100% applied here. So that clarity is still having a little bit of a boost on the city. What we can do with our overall background, or we could do it on a filled layer if we wanted to. Claudia, good question. Can punch also work on unicorns? Yes, it can work on unicorns, but only if they're pink with glitter. So yes, it works on anything that you've got I don't want to say unnatural, because a rainbow is obviously natural, but an enhanced amount of color. Punch is just going to help it just enrich it a little bit more. Okay, so with our background layer, I'm going to use levels. I could do this with a filled layer, so I could do it on top of everything else, but we haven't really made many changes, so I'm not too worried about doing it on the background. And all I'm going to do is just pull this in here and stretch, and you see the histogram at the top of the screen. I'm stretching that histogram to make the darks a bit darker and the lights a bit lighter. So if I do a before and after, it's a really subtle change. But all it's doing is it's just adding a little bit of contrast in without necessarily hurting the middle and pulling it away from the midtones. In fact, if anything, I'm just going to reduce the amount of shadows that I forced darker because I was losing too much down here in the trees. Okay. Now here's the other one, high dynamic range. Let's pull down our highlights. Now look at the effect that has on the overall picture. I'm not going to do it this much, I'm just doing this to show you. We're probably going to do it to about there and no more. But if again I do before and after with just the HDR tool. So I'm not pulling down the whites. If I pull down whites, well, we lose some of the nice stuff in the clouds here and also some of the rainbow elements. It's just the highlights I want to pull down because I wanted to affect this bit up here and just darken that down to make more of a feature of that rainbow itself. If I wanted to, I could pull up blacks a little bit, which is going to increase the visibility of these trees down here. Remember, if ever you want to know what a part of an image sits in terms of this histogram, remember as I'm moving across the image, you've got the orange bar that's moving left and right as I do that. That orange bar is telling you where in the histogram your mouse pointer currently sits. So down here, I can see, yes, I'm in the shadows, but actually it's the very, very darkest parts of those shadows. So that's considered the black scale here in the high dynamic range tool. So the brightest part of highlights is called whites. The darkest parts of shadows is called blacks. Highlights and shadows also pull up whites and blacks, but the whites and black sliders only pull up the very extreme ends of the histogram. So by pulling up those blacks just a touch, again, don't overdo it. If we do that, we end up with a flattened image and it looks cartoony. But we can pull it up a bit just to get some of that detail back from the shadows that were down here. And then overall, if I really wanted to just make the focus on this center part here, I could pull in a little bit of vignette. The irony is, having pulled in the light fall off recovery, so if I go back to my lens menu, it doesn't make sense that I've pulled up light fall off. So I've made the outskirts and the corners brighter, and then pulled in a vignette. That really doesn't make sense. So just be conscious of what you're doing between the two different things. If you've used light fall off, it's going to be more natural to pull up the corners than using reverse vignette. So try and do it on the lens tab first. If you want to enhance it more, then do it with a vignette. Now we've got one final choice that we could make here if we wanted to, which is to use a radial gradient. So again, if I start drawing with a radial mask here, it's going to flip to my existing adjustment layer. And remember, that layer has already got a mask. So if I start drawing a radial, I've just replaced my mask that I already drew. So be really careful the second time you create a new gradient. So let's call this one sky. And I'm going to create a new mask now manually, or a new layer manually, and call this one center, depending on how you spell it. Okay. So with this one, let's go to our radial mask, and I'm going to choose this part in here, and you'll hopefully see what I'm doing. Let's make the fall off really soft. So just like with the radial, or just like with the straight gradient mask, the bigger the distance between this line and this line, the softer the fall off is going to be. Okay, now at the moment that's only affecting the outside, not the inside. I want to affect the inside. So how do I do that? Well, I right click on the mask and go to invert, and that now has the reverse effect, so I can actually pull this out a little bit more here. Great. Now with my mask, I'm going to press M again to turn it off so I can see the image. And with this part, I'm just going to pull down our exposure a touch. Now that's also going to affect down here, so I want to be careful with that. When I'm happy with the change that I've put in, which I sort of am, I just want to expand it a little bit there, okay. When I'm happy with that and I want to remove this part down here, let's turn my mask on, I can go to my eraser tool, right click on the image, choose quite a big brush. I'm going to go pretty well, 100% opacity, really soft on the hardness. And the second I click the first time, it's going to say, do you want to rasterize the mask? What that means is from this point onwards, I can no longer edit that gradient as if it were a gradient. I can no longer use the gradient tool or pull those lines left and right. It becomes almost like a painted bitmap mask. In this case, that's fine. I'm happy with the gradient as it is. So rasterize. And now I'm going to erase all of this lot down the bottom. So I now have a really neat semicircular mask in the middle, which I can control the exposure of independently of the rest of the shot. So with that, I'm just going to pull it down a touch. Again, not too much, be really subtle with this stuff. And that's where we get to. So let's go before and after. Where's our before? There we go. Again, nothing wrong with this shot. Really like it. There's our after, and it just pops a little bit more. If I go back to our original, so let's just, clone that variant and reset everything. Even though it was only a tiny amount off center, if we look at the difference between this and this, it actually makes a big difference having that rainbow right in the middle of the image. And to do that, we use the crop tool with the grid and just make sure that that grid line lines up left to right, and we've got the horizon straight. If we don't like how cool this image has become, well, that's easy. We just go back to our background layer and we can warm it up a little bit. So we can go back to there, and actually we can pull up a little bit more sunset color in there. So between the two of them, again, before and after, very small changes. Each one is a tiny adjustment, but it has a huge effect on how vivid and vibrant that rainbow is, especially the punch effect on clarity. So if I go back to our before and after, how bright and vibrant that rainbow becomes with just that little change of clarity, and changing the clarity setting to be punch instead of natural. Okay, let's go and have a look at a slightly different image. This one from Marco. In fact, we've got two from Marco in here. I'm just going to have a little play with this one, I think. This one's very cool, but I think this one's the one that we're going to pull out in most detail. Okay, so again, loaded in the right lens profile in here. We can do a manual chromatic aberration analyze, which is going to make it correct for that lens on that particular camera rather than the stock one that's been used for the profile. In terms of sharpness, oh, sorry, question from Andrea. Could we say that clarity only affects midtones? So, my stance, and this is a personal stance, to me, it has the greatest effect on midtones. So I see it as a mid-tone enhancement tool. Clarity, absolutely, it takes that sort of middle ground. And if you think about what clarity is actually doing, have a look on YouTube. There's a video it's about 20 minutes long, and it's specifically on clarity. And it covers exactly the difference between clarity, structure, and sharpening. It's on our pro tips section, so have a look, and it'll cover all of this. But in brief, what clarity is doing is it's looking at every area of contrast and every difference, and it's saying to every place where there's a neighbor, are you darker or lighter than your neighbor? And if you're slightly darker, go darker still. If you're slightly lighter, then go lighter still. So it creates these boundaries between areas of tiny contrast and makes the contrast quite a lot bigger. So in essence, you're going to see it most in the midtones. So to me, if I want to bring the midtones out, and this is a perfect example on our screen now, so we'll have a look in a second. But if I want to bring the midtones out, then clarity is probably the go-to tool to start with. But be careful that you don't over-egg it, because you can end up with halos. So it's not purely a midtone adjustment tool, but to me, it has the most effect on the midtones. And different question. If we crop a picture, this is Bjorn. Was that your picture, Bjorn? I think maybe it was. It may be the Bjorn that was doing that picture. So if we crop a picture, is there any way to see the remaining pixels? In my setting, it's always related to the chosen output for processing. Yeah, there is. So if you go into crop, up here, this part here that's darkened is always going to show you the outside, the bit that's not included in your final crop. So even on this case, let's create a clone of that variant. And if I now cropped at 1:2, let's say, and cropped it in a little tighter, right inside the rainbow, for example, into there, and I want to be able to see the rest of the image, then all I've got to do is just go back to the crop tool. So if I click on the crop tool, you'll see everything out here. Also remember that you're also seeing out here, on your previews, you're also seeing the crop there. So you can actually set, there's a preference setting in Capture One. Let me just remember where it is. I can't remember where it is. Here. So you've got the mask setting in here. So I can change how dark or light that mask is, showing me the crop. And that also affects down here. It's also telling you whether or not you've got a frame on it, or whether you've got the handles up here. But that setting in here will tell you how you're viewing the rest of the picture. So yes, you can always get back to seeing the rest of the picture, and remember that except for a mask, if you've only drawn a mask over a certain part of the picture, everything else, all your other changes, will apply to the whole picture whether you've cropped it or not. So you're not just making changes to within the crop, you're making changes to the whole picture except for where you've drawn a mask over a specific area. So I hope that answers the question. If not, then just put another question on and we'll pick it up. Okay, so back to Marco's cityscape shot. So again, it's a perfect example of clarity we're going to come up to. So on this shot, f11, there might be a little diffraction in there, but I'm pretty sure it's okay. We're really, really wide out on this lens here. Let me just try and see what we get with a bit of correction. Not a huge amount. I'll leave it off. Okay, got a little bit of sharpness fall off to deal with. Not much light fall off. And again, let's just we've loaded in. This happens to be another Fuji image. Let's go to my crop tool. and go to the original crop format. Now in this case, the distortion at 100 hasn't had any effect on the crop in this particular lens. So this particular lens at 31mm or 31.5mm down here, Capture One's decided, you know what, there isn't enough distortion to worry about the edges, so I don't need to crop in. All it's done, if you have a look at very carefully on the screen as I do this, it's changing the pincushion effect, or the fisheye effect that you get in the middle of the image, and we're correcting that barrel. So that's all it's done. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always losing pixels. It depends on the focal length of your camera and the lens and the camera model and what Capture One has decided is the best thing to do to get the best image quality out of it. So in this case, it's fine with all the borders. If I wanted to crop it in further, I could, but in this case, we don't have to. Not much light fall off. We're not exactly high contrast, so I'm not going to worry about any purple fringing. Again, on our color tab, so this one up here, the three wheels together, we've got our curve, and in this particular camera, so the XE1, it doesn't load into those raw files the Fuji's film simulation. So just because it's a Fuji camera doesn't mean necessarily that you get the film simulations. It's only on cameras where you do have a film simulation, and that then gets loaded into the raw. So in this case, well, we've actually got built in here our happy little Capture One film high contrast curve. So linear response is going to flatten everything out. Well, it was flat to start with. I don't want to make it flatter. Let's not do that. The auto curve is going to do quite a bit, but let's have a look at this high contrast one, and that starts to make it pop already for me. So I'm going to start with a film simulation curve. And if we look at what that's done to the histogram, if I go back to auto, you see the auto histogram is a bit more squished into the middle. Anything on a histogram that's squished into one area, one small area, typically means you're losing contrast. It doesn't matter where on the histogram that sits, whether it's in the highlights or the shadows or in the middle. Typically it ends up in the middle, but wherever it's squished into one particular area, it means that you've got a lack of contrast in that image. So if I go back into film high contrast, you see that histogram has stretched a little bit, and that's given us a bit of a contrast pop, which is exactly what we want. Back to our exposure tab. Let's try, I'm not sure what time of day this was shot at, but you know, again, with exposure, with white balance, we can create more of a sunset-y feel, or we can create more of a moonlight feel and so on, depending on the city. I wasn't there when this was shot, but my gut feel is to push it a little bit up towards here, into the sort of sunset-y, sort of dusky feel. It's not quite blue hour from what I can make out, so we'll sort of stick to around there. Okay, with that, so let's play. Let's have a look at our clarity. So the clarity is set to natural right now. Let's click the button, and there you can see. So back to whose question was it? Andrea's question about clarity. Does it affect the midtones, or is it a midtone tool? It's not purely a midtone tool, but look at what happens to the histogram when I click this button. So keep your eye on that histogram, and I'm going to click the button now. And you can see the bits either side of the midtone seem to have sort of got more enriched. They've got more voluminous. So it's pulled those midtones and it's made the darker bits darker, the lighter bits lighter, and that creates the effect of contrast. Again, don't overdo it. On this shot, we're probably okay. But if you overdo it, you end up with these halos around the edges of contrast areas, and it can look pretty ugly. So be really careful with it. But in this case, we can push it quite a way. And cities, you can afford to push clarity quite a way away. Beyond that, we can, of course, change our mode of clarity. So let's change it to punch, and you'll see what's happened. So remember I said in the one just now, punch tends to increase the saturation of color as well as the contrast. You can see that there. So if I go back to our natural version, it's lost a bit of that color. Neutral is the same amount of clarity or amount of contrast boost that you get with punch, but without the saturation boost. And classic is old school clarity. So if you have a look at between classic and natural, you'll find that natural can effectively pop a city a bit better, whereas classic tends to be a bit cartoony if you overdo it too much. So on this one, natural is fine, that's perfectly good. And we're going to use our levels tool to really pull the contrast out. So we've pulled the contrast in the middle using that clarity tool. Now let's use the levels tool to pull the contrast up towards the highlights and down towards the shadows. So what that means is we're going to stretch the histogram. The tool to stretch the histogram is either the curves tool or the levels tool. And if it's only bits that are missing on the ends, so the bottom left and the top right, then the levels tool is perfectly good for you. If you're trying to do it at a micro level and make maybe this area here, a little more contrasty, then you'd have to do it in curves, because we'd have to attack this area in here and draw a little S shape in that area of the curve. But if we're just trying to make the highlights lighter and the shadows darker, that's what levels is for. So let's use levels to do it. So we're going to pull down this line here. And what I'm looking at is to make sure that on here we haven't got any data that goes off the edge of the histogram. If it goes off the edge, we're into overexposed and we've lost the detail. And then likewise down here in the shadows, we can pull our shadows down there. And again, make sure you haven't lost anything off into the shadows underexposed. So this effectively, our levels tool, think of it as a histogram stretcher. It stretches out the histogram, makes the brights brighter, the darks darker. Now you can achieve similar effects using the high dynamic range tool, because obviously in version, I think it was this version 20? Maybe it was the version before, I lose track of it. Basically, high dynamic range only used to work for recovery. You could only make shadows lighter, or you could only make highlights darker. Now you can make shadows even darker still. Likewise, you can make highlights even brighter still. So you can do some levels work with the high dynamic range tool, and it's going to attack just the top parts and just the bottom. But levels takes the whole histogram and stretches the whole thing out. So you not only pull up the highlights, but you also pull up the midtones to the right of the middle point of 128, and if you're pulling down the levels in the lower part, you're also pulling down the lower midtones down towards the shadows too. Okay, so with this, the rest of it actually looks pretty good. I'm going to pull down our highlights just a bit to get our texture back in the sky up here. We might need to do a little bit of noise reduction. I mean, it was at ISO 3200. Bruce has made it in. I made it. Good morning. Morning, Bruce. So let's go into our magnifying glass little tab here. So the magnifying glass is effectively the details tab. So if I go into here, this is where you're going to find things like the focus tool, but also the sharpening tool, noise reduction, film grain, and so on. So in this case, we're going to have a look at our noise reduction, and we're just going to pull up a bit more luminance noise reduction in there. Be careful with noise reduction, because you can lose sharpness, and it's a real tough one, this, because people end up in this seesaw effect of trying to do a bit of noise reduction, then it gets a bit blurry, so then we use sharpening to get rid of the blur, but that then introduces noise. So just be really careful with it. In this case, I'm going to pull up noise reduction a little bit, pull sharpening up a little bit, with our threshold a bit higher and the radius a bit smaller. And again, if you want to go into the sharpening stuff in detail, we will do a session actually on a lot more sharpening in future. But in the meantime, go onto those pro tips videos, and there's a whole one on sharpening in there. It's actually part of the clarity, because it's sharpening is clarity and structure is a form of sharpening. So the one that says clarity, structure, and sharpening, that one's going to discover or expand a lot on what the sharpening tool can actually do. So that one looks pretty good. We've got rid of a lot of the noise out in the distance. Just remember as well your preview. If you want to check for noise, don't check for it out here when you're zoomed out. You need to zoom in and wait for Capture One to refresh that preview at 100%. At 100%, it's reading the raw file and it's applying the noise reduction. Anything less than that, and it's probably just reading the preview file, which was loaded in, especially with noise, at the point the preview was done. And it's doing some simulation of the changes, but not as good as loading in the raw file again. So if you get to 100%, you'll see that little pop just afterwards where the noise reduction kicks in, because Capture One's now reprocessed that image at 100% from the raw with the noise reduction. So again, let's do a quick before and after. So there's our before. Looked pretty cool before, right? But it looks a lot cooler now. So all we've done here is made that city just pop. It's come to life a bit more. We've got more contrast in it. We've pulled out those midtones, some of the haze. So clarity is great for getting rid of haze in a picture, especially when you're doing long distances on a cityscape from the top. And overall, we've just made this feel a bit more urban than the sort of slightly greeny blue tint that was here before. My guess is this was possibly taken through a window or a plane window potentially. I'm not sure whether it was a tower window or a plane window or something like that. Whenever you shoot through glass, a telltale sign is that the picture tends to look a bit greeny in tint. So the first thing you want to do is correct for white balance, and you want to maybe pull the tint up a little bit just to do that. Okay, let's move on to a shot by Michael. This one we're not going to spend too much time on. I just want to touch on it, which is when I loaded this picture in, I was like, wow, that bird is really sharp, really crisp. And it is. And the layers that Michael's put on here are wonderful. You've got layers over here to pull out the texture in the feather. And actually, let me just zoom in so you can see a bit clearer. So we've got a layer here that he's built in just to pull out, let me turn off the mask. So just to correct some of the detail in those feathers. It's been done with brightness. It could have also been done with the high dynamic range tool, but both are perfectly fine in this case. And that just brings the feathers back down to a nice same level as the rest of it, where it's catching the light. We've got another one here which actually affects the saturation of the image. And in general, it's pretty much over the bird. So let's just zoom out. So we've got this area here that was over the bird. And we've got this one here, which is our background. Now the problem is, and what didn't really work for me, when I looked at it, there's this green sort of tint all the way around the bird, and I couldn't work out whether it was meant to be or not. So here's our original, and here's the layers that Michael's done. The problem is the mask, and it's that simple. So effectively, the mask doesn't match the shape of the bird, and this is just down to how long you want to spend doing the mask. So if I create a clone of this variant, and I'm just going to really quickly just show you. So with our brush tool here, I'm going to make the size a lot smaller. Actually need the hardness to be a little bit, so not quite as soft at the edge, because we're going to go right into the bird. I'm going to set my opacity down a little bit just so I don't go over things too much. I can also see in here, there's a little bit of fringing that's going on. And we've already done an analyze on there, on the edge of these feathers, which is just got to be careful with. But anyway, let's go back to our background and start painting in a bit closer to the bird. Now, of course, what we could do is use a luma range to avoid the bird. However, if we do that, there's an awful lot in the rest of this picture that's also going to get picked up by that luma range. So we've got to be a bit careful with it. But in general, let me just do this. I'm doing this really quickly. Things like this, if you want to separate the bird out from the background, you're going to spend a long time in masking. You can refine the edge of the mask. So we can go to refine mask. We can feather it as well. But the way that this one has been drawn is pretty much over the entire image and then excluding the bird. And we probably, my gut feel would have been we'd have done the opposite. So we would have gone into the whole image, created a fill layer over the whole image, and then probably removed the bird using the erase tool and then refined that edge. But just for now, just to see why it's so important, let's go into here. Again, I'm being really rough. I just don't want you guys to watch me draw a mask for hours and hours on the screen. I'm going to turn the mask off, and now we start to see the difference. So again, if I went to our previous one with this green tint here, through to there, it's really important to mask all the way around the bird. Otherwise, I mean, the edit on this I actually really like. The separation of the bird, really cool. We've got a couple of bits up here. If we are going to mask, then we've still got some bits left in it there. That's because the mask wasn't 100%. But yeah, absolutely. To separate it out from here, great. But the other option you have is you don't have to have the hard line around the bird itself. What we can do, just do a quick example. So I'm going to use my radial mask. I'm going to draw a thin circle, and as I move my mouse towards the middle ring, I can twist that gradient. I can twist the mask and I can make it fit this bird. So if I do this here, and remember the starter for a radial mask is to have the outside masked and the inside not. So with that, I could then pull down our exposure. It has the same effect almost, and we'd have to do a little bit of tweaking, as this, but without the glow, without that harsh line that, that's painted around the bird. We can still do all the same stuff with the bird overall. So, you know, we can increase our saturation just a touch. We can push our clarity up a bit. That's going to make the bird stand out a little bit more. We could pull our highlights down just a touch. We can pull our contrast up. We can actually pull our exposure up a little bit now as well. And if we're not happy with the amount that we've knocked down this hedge down here, well, we can have another layer. So I'm going to call that layer bird isolation. And then we're going to have this one called lower hedge and our gradient tool. So I can draw another gradient mask up here. And with this one, I can pull down that hedge even more with either brightness or exposure or both if I want, to really take it away from that. So to me, it's a lovely way that the bird itself has been processed. But the problem is with this outside bit, and anything you do with a mask, if you look really closely, you're probably going to see it, especially where the bird's in flight, because you haven't got that sharp edge around the bird because they're moving. So to me, my gut feel would be to be a bit more natural with it, to have a nice fall off, which is this one. So you've got a radial mask that falls off as it goes away from the bird, and anything else you want to darken, just add on another mask and do exactly that. Nothing stopping us cropping it in the same way, so we can come in, I think it was to just there, I think Michael had it, if I'm right. Let me just look at the image up above just to check. Possibly even in, yeah, it's in there. So we can do that. We get to, you know, there as well. But it's just, to me, this just feels a bit more natural, a bit more real than the other edit that just feels a bit too cut out. That's my only concern with it, Michael, because you know, I love the colors on here. You can still do the same on here, but I'm not a fan of this immediate fall off of sort of black background to the bird itself. It feels right to have at least some hint of the background left in there. Anthony's asked a question, one question unrelated. Can I somehow import masks from Photoshop to Capture One because Photoshop has more powerful mask and selecting tools? No, is the answer. No. You can, well, what a lot of people have asked for, layer integration with alpha channels and stuff like that. There are certain ways that things like layers with annotations and stuff can come across, but as it stands right now, no, the two are separate. You can't take a Photoshop mask into Capture One. It's just not going to work that way. Okay, so let's have a look at, where are we? Vincent's shot. So I talked about fireworks earlier with clarity and punch. So let's have a look at that. So here's a Canon lens profile loaded in. Great. Again, let me just show you actually. So this is with the correct lens profile loaded in. If I switch to generic, what you can see has happened. So we're out at 35mm here. Because Capture One doesn't know the profile of that lens, you saw the distortion change, right? So let's just switch back so you can see it. So back to the Canon. Watch specifically this tower and this red tower here. So watch what happens when I load in the correct lens profile. Straightened it right up. And the reason it's done that is because it's loaded in this distortion slider to 100. If I go back to 0, we'd end up with a little bit of a lean on it, but nowhere near as bad as the generic one was going to have. This is why it's important that you have to choose the correct lens. If you don't have the correct lens loaded in, then go to manufacturer profile or go to generic. Don't try and wing it with a lens that looks similar. It's just not going to have the same effect. It's going to get it wrong. So let's have a little look at what we've got to do still. Even though we've got that distortion correction in, we've still got a slight lean on this tower here. One of the reasons might be we're not quite straight. So before you do anything with something like keystoning, do the straighten tool and just make sure that your horizon is level. So it's the horizon first, then the rest of it. So first off, let's do that. That's good. Then we can use a grid if we want to, just to check. And if we don't like the grid, we can turn on guides. So guides are really handy because I can move them to exactly where I want. If I want to check whether that tower is completely level, I can just draw a line up to the very top of the antenna up here and make sure it hits its reflection, which should, in theory, be a mirror image. Down here. So we can see it's slightly out. Well, let's go to our straighten tool, because I don't have to use the straighten tool horizontally. I can also use it vertically and it will have the same effect. So the vertical use of that tool seems to have fixed that right up. That looks pretty good. This tower is now nice and straight too. Reflections are really useful to try and straighten an image because you can make sure that you've got that complete vertical alignment, which is really important. Now on this one, we've got a lot of space down here. Again, if you're shooting for a magazine or whatever and you want that negative space, then go for it. But again, it depends on how it feels like a print on a wall if you're producing it for print. To me, I would be tempted just to move up a little bit, probably with a 1:2 crop. because I like them at the moment. Let's move it up to here. Now you can see I'm trying to push up to get more of that tower in, and I'm losing it. I can't get up there, and the reason is if I go back to my lens tab down here, we've got this option here, crop outside image. If I tick that box, it allows me to go outside the image, which is great, yeah? So it means that I can get the whole of the tower in, but be really careful, because I also now, if I just change this to be a light background, you can see that a bit easier. I've now got this weird angle down here. This was outside of the image. So if I go back to my crop tool, you can now see all of this stuff here in white in the crop has no detail in it, no data. So what I can do is I can go into Photoshop or another pixel-based editor. I can go into Affinity or whatever, and I could load in some content-aware fill tools to fill in that sky. Or, here's a little trick. If we're not too worried about the complete architectural accuracy of this shot, I can use keystoning to fix this. Because what I can do is I can trick Capture One into making that left-hand side a bit bigger by hitting apply. A bit too big there, actually. Let's just make that back down to there and to there. So what I've done is I've convinced Capture One that the left-hand side should be bigger using the keystone tool. So I've used the horizontal keystone tool. And instead of leaving these level, we know that the picture is level. We've got to be careful with that as well with this tool. So we know the picture is level. Let's be really, really conscious of that. But by tweaking these points a tiny, tiny bit, not too much, tiny bit, we can force Capture One to stretch this left-hand side and leave the right-hand side where it was. So the keystone tool is great for correcting things when we want to get it architecturally correct. It's also great for manipulating things when I want to get the crop right in the picture. So just again, use it sparingly, use it very, very carefully, but effectively we can use keystone to take an image which was that, and we can make it do that on one side or that on the other side, or we can also do it vertically. We can make it stretch the top, stretch the bottom. It doesn't work if this whole picture was full of buildings that have weird lines as a result of using the keystone tool in an abusive way, but in this particular case it works. It means that I don't have to fill in that sky, and we've got our tower in as well. Okay, so we're at 1.2 seconds worth of exposure, so we've got a lot of detail in these fireworks. Yep, loads of detail in there. Let's go on to our, I'm going to leave it on an auto curve actually. Auto's pretty good for fireworks, so we'll leave that where it is. On our exposure tab, I'm going to do a couple of things. So one, this has actually got some of the I was playing with this before, I didn't realize that. Let me just reset that tool so you can see. Back to there. So this is actually the original shot. We can pull back a lot more detail than we want to as a result of using the high dynamic range tool. Sorry, it threw me a little bit there because I was like, hold on a second, I'm sure this was darker. So with our high dynamic range tool, of course, we can pull up shadows a little bit. We can also pull up blacks. We can pull down our highlights to get more detail on the fireworks, and the same with whites. So let's reset it and go through what each one of those does. Let's have a little look up here. So you've got to be careful with fireworks because you don't actually want to pull down the highlights and the whites too much. You see that effect? You lose the firework effect. Everything goes a bit dull. So whites in this case isn't going to have a huge effect on it, but the highlights really is. So this is natural here. This is overexposed on the highlights, or pushing the highlights even further. Pulling it down a little bit will help with some of the other lights, like over here, but don't do it too much, because if you do, you lose the firework effect of the firework. It becomes a little bit flat and dull. Okay, so that's our highlights put down. And then again, with our little orange bar on our histogram up here, we're going to use that across the image to tell us where we are. So here we're almost in the blacks area of the shadows. Here we're in the shadows area, shadows here, shadows here. So most of this image, apart from when we're up in the firework, is in the shadows. So we've got a decision to make. Do you want to pull up the blacks, which is the very darkest part? That's going to have the effect of bringing up more of the sky but flattening the image. Or do I want to pull up the shadows a little bit? Or do I want to do neither? I can even pull the shadows darker still if I really want to. I'm going to lose the tower. To me, I'd pull up the shadows a touch. I wouldn't pull up the blacks because we get all of this stuff up here that isn't actually interesting in the shot, and we're going to pull that into focus. So maybe a couple of points, 2 or 3, but it's the shadows that are worth pulling up here a little bit and the highlights down a touch. That's looking pretty nice. On here as well, we've got our shot white balance. To be honest, it's pretty good. It's got it kind of right. I wouldn't do too much with it. We could warm it up a little bit, but that feels wrong. It should feel a bit more night sky-y. So let's go to probably about there. It's looking pretty nice. Let's just remove some of that pink in that. Okay, and that's probably it. There is a temptation I've got in my mind, and again, this is where it's a personal preference. These lights down the bottom here at the edge of a print can be distracting. So to me, I'd be tempted just to lose them. We can lose them really quickly with the healing tool. Healing tool's up here, the sort of sticky plaster thing. If I don't have an adjustment layer already set over here, as I start to draw, just going to reduce that. On heal, generally your opacity is going to be 100% and have a soft brush to help it blend. And let's just draw over there. It's going to choose where to take it from. Got it right. Cool. But that just means I've got rid of that distraction on the edge of the print, especially when you're planning on printing or framing something or looking at it on display. You don't really want a distraction near the edge of a print or on a mount. It just brings your eye straight to it, and the whole point is to bring it over to here. So again, let's go before and after. So here's our before. There's our after. If we don't like the amount of shadow that we've pulled up in this shot, really easy, just pull that slider down and we get back to there. But the key thing is, remember, before and after will keep your keystone and your crop so you can compare like for like. If we actually want to see a real before and after, we need to reset the original picture. So that's our original picture there. And there's our edit there. So slightly different. We've increased some of the shadow stuff. If we wanted to get rid of some of this stuff here, then it's really easy. We can just use a manual brush. So let's go into our brush tool and create a new layer. Call it smoke, and be really careful. So use a low opacity or a low flow, depending on how you want to paint, and just bring a mask across these shadows, or sorry, this smoke stuff along here. And we can actually go over the fireworks, because what we're going to do is we're going to use our shadow tool to pull that stuff down a bit. And then we got a question, Kevin, would you crop a little off the left? Darker on the side seems unbalanced. Up to you. So it depends on the crop ratio. Again, so if we go back to our original ratio, 2:3, and crop, we could get to there. I'm going to lose a bit too much to the right, I fear. But we could actually get out to maybe here. Yep, that may be a bit better balanced. Yep, nothing wrong with that. So yeah, that works. Just depends on what you want to have in your frame. Simon saying no clarity. You're right, Simon. I said we'd touch clarity, and I haven't. So exactly. Let's go on to our clarity tool. You're right. Be careful with the mix of HDR through to clarity. There is no point in enhancing contrast with clarity if you're then going to pull down all that contrast with HDR. So remember, as you pull the clarity, sorry, the high dynamic range sliders into recovery mode, which is bringing the bright areas down or the shadow areas up, we're losing contrast. Then you're dialing in clarity to bring in contrast. So try and stick to one or the other. In this case, the highlights it's right to pull it down a little bit to get some detail back into these fireworks, but clarity is going to make them pop a little bit more. Again, this is clarity set to natural. Let me put it way up, more than it should be, just so you can see. Let me switch this to punch. And you'll see that it's just got more vivid, it's more vibrant, more punchy. Now, I'm just conscious of time in terms of this session. What we would do, in theory, we'd leave our clarity at natural down to here for the whole image. And then what I would do is pull in a new layer called Fireworks. Oops, spelt right. Nah, don't worry. And draw over with our brush. Let's turn the mask on so we can see our fireworks area in particular. And with that, we're then going to add in a bit more clarity, but set to punch. So that punch is now only affecting the fireworks. It's not making the rest of the city skyline look overdone. So fireworks can go as vibrant and as saturated as you want. It doesn't really mean that they're fireworks. They're meant to be exciting and meant to be vivid and really pop. But in general, a city isn't. So if you're going to do this with fireworks and you want to really use that punch clarity and really push it up, try and do it on a layer that we've got a specific area brushed in, like here, over the fireworks, and leave the rest of the image alone, leave the city alone. But yeah, thanks, Simon. It was good call. I said I'd talk about clarity and punch on fireworks, and we didn't. Where are we? Would you be concerned about clipping the edge of the firework reflection on the bottom? Not particularly. This distracts me a little bit down here, so I might be tempted actually to come up a little bit. But it depends on what crop ratio you're going to be happy with, to be honest. So if I wanted to go, back to 1:2 sort of thing, we end up in a weird sort of crop if we try and do this without including that. So I'd be tempted to leave that as it is, just redo that clarity, and maybe even just soften down this reflection so it's not quite as distracting. A little more drawing in the high tower wouldn't hurt. Yeah, I agree. So you can draw extra on here if you want to pull the tower out. It is sort of missing in the smoke a little bit. And then finally from Dan, could you use Luma to pull down the smoke? Yes, you could. But Luma in this case, if I look at this orange line on my histogram, look at where that is, and then look at where this is, where even this building is. You're going to have to be careful because a lot of it is in the same area of the histogram, and the Luma range is pretty blunt. It's going to say, well, if you're in this area, then apply, and if you're not, then don't. I'm going to end up erasing a lot of stuff and drawing a lot of stuff, in which case I might have found it easier just to draw around the smoke in the first place. And finally, ST, any chance of getting rid of the smoke around the fireworks? Yeah, so on our smoke layer here, which is masked there, I could, of course, bring down our brightness into there. And I could pull down our exposure if I want to, but again, be careful with where you've brushed because you can start to see my brush marks in there. So if you're going to do that, you've got to be really, really soft and feathered with your brush strokes when you're coming to do that stuff. So just be really careful when you're trying to pull down an area that you don't show where you've masked by overdoing it. Okay, so again, let's go, here we are, before, through to after, and that clarity just pumps it, but beyond that, just doing some of the recovery stuff really makes a firework stand out. So that's it for today. Remember, everyone, have a look on Facebook if you want to continue that conversation about what's going on. We've also got all of those YouTube guides on the pro tip section, so have a look on that. There's a playlist on YouTube which has got all of those tips and stuff, and we go in depth into things like sharpening and clarity and so on, and even all the clarity modes. And remember, the next session I think is a little while away. It's on the 13th, which is next Thursday. So send in images using that standard upload tool. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. You'll get an option to please include your name, so we know whose image it is. But get the option to upload more than one file if you need to, and tell us what you're looking at. And in the meantime, so it's 10 days between now and when I speak to you guys next. So stay safe, stay healthy, stay alive, and all that sort of stuff. And we will catch you next week. Cheers, everyone. Bye.